I had mentioned in a previous video talking about whether Nevin was one of the Morrigans that we don't actually know what the Morrigan's proper name would be. So there's two main candidates, Anu and Danu. The problem is we really don't have enough information to have any real idea of which one would have been the more likely option. I have my own opinions, which we'll get into in a minute, but the actual evidence we have, we just don't know. There's not enough to answer the question. So all of our sources for this are really coming from a single text called the Llyfr Gwal, the Book of Invasions of Ireland. This exists in multiple recensions or versions, and those versions are often contradictory, hence where the problem comes in. Also really common in a lot of Irish mythology to have these contradictions. It's important to understand, particularly with the Llyfr Gwal, that this is a text that was assembled from a lot of different regional beliefs. They were all kind of squished together to try to make a cohesive whole, and it doesn't really work particularly well. So even within one single version, you'll find contradictions, and then if you go between the different versions, you'll find a lot of contradictions. So, for example, the argument for Anu as the Morrigan's first name comes from a passage which says, Ernmas had 3 other daughters, Baif, Macha, and the Morrigan, and a 7th, Anu. Now, that same passage in a different version of the text says, Ernmas had 3 other daughters, Baif, Macha, and the Morrigan, who was called Anu. So, clearly that's a problem. They cannot both be true, but they might have represented different regional beliefs that were happening. It's also a little complicated because the older Irish material, they use, the scribes used sort of these shorthand symbols. So there was one symbol for and there was a different symbol that meant that is. And unfortunately, it does happen, and at least scholars have strongly argued that this happens, that scribes would make errors when they were recopying manuscripts or text or stories and accidentally switch them out. So instead of that is, it would be and. Instead of and, it would be that is. And in this case, that would explain where the issue is coming in, but we still don't know which one would have originally been the correct version. Is it the Morrigan that is Anu, or is it the Morrigan and Anu? Clearly very different meanings depending on how we're interpreting that, and we just don't know. So this same text elsewhere says that Danu has 3 sons, and then in a different section says that those 3 same sons belong to the Morrigan, and hence that the Morrigan is Danu. So is that correct? Is the Anu passage correct? We just do not know. Adding even more confusion to this mix, the original term for Tuatha Dé Danann was just Tuatha Dé, and it meant people of the gods. However, when the Christian scribes came in, they were using that same phrase for the Israelites when they were translating biblical material to Irish. Clearly, you can't have that. Very confusing. So they added Danann onto Tuatha Dé. So Tuatha Dé Danann is normally understood as people of the goddess Danu. However, John Carey, in his very excellent article on this subject, strongly argues, and I actually agree with him, that it was originally most likely supposed to be people of the gods of skill. And this has to do with the word Don, which then becomes Danann in this particular version. And I'm not going to get off into an old Irish linguistic lecture, but it's entirely possible that he's correct, and he supports his argument really well. And this does make sense because other places in the text we have references to Na Trí Eistena, the 3 gods of skill, who are important big figures within this group. So the idea that they would have then been called the people of the gods of skill actually does make a lot of sense. So you can see kind of where my opinion is coming in here. I do suggest checking out John Carey's article if you can find it. Really good, really gets into depth with all of this. Now, where this additionally gets complicated, because everything gets complicated with Irish mythology, is we don't ever actually see Anu or Danu referenced in any of the texts. They are referred to as Anan and Danan, and these are particular grammatical forms of those names that would normally indicate like possession. It was like a possessive form, and not in the nominative or the genitive, which is what we expect. So that also throws a bit of a wrench in the works here, because then it's really unclear whether these names actually did exist, and again, scribal error were just inserted incorrectly, or whether these were never supposed to be names, they were supposed to be grammatical forms of words, hence John Kerry's argument about Dawn and Danan, which again, I won't get into because you can just read his article, but it makes it a very messy subject. Now, I personally tend to favor the idea that the Morrigan, and of course that is a title, it means either Great Queen or Phantom Queen, that the proper name for that figure probably would have been Anu, but I don't know. None of us really know for sure. A lot of people feel that it's Danu, even if Danu was created by these Christian scribes as a deity and kind of inserted into this, which is one theory you'll find scholars saying. She is a goddess now today, she is worshipped and acknowledged today, so not discounting that. Just a bit of a muddy question as to how far back she actually goes and whether she was found and acknowledged during the pagan period in Ireland. Evidence is a little sketchy on that one, so we don't know. So our two main options for the Morrigan's proper name are both equally messy, really cannot be 100% supported, and we just don't have enough evidence in any direction to know for certain. It really just comes down to personal belief, if you are even concerned about what her actual name would be, whether you believe it's Anu or Danu. At this point, having been writing about the Morrigan for about 13 years and sort of more intensely studying her for maybe like 20, I have taken a very agnostic approach to what her name is. I generally just refer to it as the Morrigan. It's usually very clear in the text that she is being referred to and not someone else by that title. When we see Macha or Bai referred to as a Morrigan or one of the Morrigan, it's always very clearly that way. There isn't really much ambiguity here. And I could do a whole separate video about why Bive and the Morrigan are also complicated and often conflated with each other. Different regional variations of stories will say that it was Bive, where another one says it was the Morrigan. So that is equally messy. Whole subject, very messy. Ultimately, though, if you want to believe that Anu is the Morrigan's proper name, go ahead. If you want to believe Danu is the Morrigan's proper name, you have just as much grounds to support that. It really just comes down to personal belief.